right, let's all go ahead and jump right into this. So, today we're going to talk about the muscular system. It's going to be a part 1, part 2, maybe a part 3 series lecture because it is a little bit more intricate and a little bit more involved in what we do. So we're going to take our time moving through this system of the body. So this is kind of a neat slide that I like to show. On the right, that picture there is what your muscle looks like underneath a microscope. So it's pretty neat to see a realistic picture like that. The rest of the pictures we're going to see throughout the lecture are more of just illustrations of, a theoretical picture of what the human body and the muscle looks like. So what is the function of our skeletal muscle? That's going to be to enable the skeleton to move the body at the joints, right, through our full ranges of motion while we're playing games, while we're playing sports. And if you didn't remember this from the last lecture, remember that the muscles attach to the bones, and they can do this through the structures called tendons. And if we didn't have this arrangement, if muscles were to contract, which is one thing that they do, right, they're proteins that move, then we wouldn't be able to move the bones, and subsequently we wouldn't be able to move our bodies. So let's go through a little bit of the large and small structure, the macro and microstructure of skeletal muscle tissue. So each muscle is its own organ. It's filled with muscle tissue predominantly, but it's also got some connective tissue. It's got a lot of blood supply, so there's a lot of blood vessels that are interweaved in those tissues. And when we consider the body, we're talking about a system that has over 430 different parts to it, right? So there's about 430 muscles in the body. So if we think about it, it's one of our larger systems in the body. Now this system starts with a top layer of connective tissue, and that connective tissue is going to cover all of the muscle, and like we mentioned before, those connective tissues are going to hook into the tendons, and they're going to play a role in moving forces from the muscle where it's produced to the bones where it's going to help our bodies move. So that top layer is called the epimysium, right? And epi is supposed to mean outer, top layer. Then you have the tendons, right? We mentioned that those are connected to the muscles which connect to the bones. So the epimysium is going to cover that top layer of muscle. It's going to tie into the tendons and then connect to the bone that way. And we have those tendons at the end of each of your muscles, right? So there's proximal and distal. There's beginning and ends of muscles, and there's going to be tendons at each end of them. These bones are going to have special connective tissues. And that special connective tissue that covers the outside of the bone is what we call the periosteum. Okay, so the periosteum is on the outside of the bone. We have the tendon, which connects to that special tissue periosteum. The tendon then becomes a different setting of layers of connective tissues, and then the muscle is in between those layers of connective tissues. So like we mentioned several times, the muscles are going to pull on the tendons in turn are going to pull on the bones, and the reaction that we have is going to be movement or action. So let's get a little bit more into the nomenclature of how to identify the parts of muscles at the surface, kind of some vague descriptors. So typically when we talk about muscles, we talk about attachment sites, okay? Now if we're talking about muscles of the limbs, which would be arms, legs, we use the terms proximal and distal. Proximal means the closest part of that muscle. So if we're talking about a bicep, for example, bicep muscle starts somewhere around the shoulder joint, okay? So it would originate there. We would call that the proximal attachment of the muscle. And then it attaches somewhere past the elbow on the forearm. So we would call that, since it's furthest from the center of our body or furthest from the trunk, we would call that the distal portion of the bicep muscle. We also have different names for trunk muscles. Okay, again, it's a muscle. The majority of them are going to have two attachment points, or an origin and an insertion as we term it. but we're going to use a little bit of a different nomenclature for that. We're going to talk about proximal and inferior. All right, so proximal would mean closer to the head, and inferior would mean closer to the feet. So we have this very large muscle that runs down the center of our stomach called the rectus abdominis. And if we're talking about that muscle's proximal piece, it's kind of up near the sternum, up near where your chest is. So that would be the proximal head. And then it inserts down on the pelvis, kind of where your legs begin. And so we would refer to that as the inferior attachment of our rectus abdominis. So here's a nice overview of our macroskeletal muscle anatomy. Okay, you could see these muscles around the shoulder, deltoids, muscles at the top of your back, trapezius, everybody's favorite muscle group there in the front, the pectoralis major. You can see that rectus abdominis that I was just mentioning. Let's go a little bit down towards the legs. You can see the butt is referred to as the gluteus maximus. We see some muscles on the front side of the femur bone. We call those rectus vastus and rectus femoris, vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, vastus intermedius. There's 4 muscles there. That's why people typically refer to them as quads. And then if you look at the back side of the leg, you have what people commonly refer to as the hamstring muscles. You get the biceps femoris, which is one of the thicker portions of it. You have the semitendinosus, semimembranosus. There's 3 of those muscles there. And then you get down into the lower leg musculature, where people commonly refer to as the calves. You see some muscles in there, the gastrocnemius and the soleus. So let's get a little smaller, okay? If we're talking about individual pieces of a muscle, we refer to those as muscle fibers, and another name synonymous with that is muscle cells. And when we're looking at these cells, they're typically long and in the shape of a cylinder, and they usually run the entire length of a muscle in most muscles. There are some exceptions, but for our lecture here, for the sake of brevity, we're going to say that they run the length of a muscle. One of the unique appearances that we see in a muscle cell compared to every other cell is that they have many nuclei. Remember, the nuclei are kind of the brain of the cell. They store all the DNA, and they usually assist in most of the reparation of the cell. And if we look at it under a microscope, kind of like we looked at in the beginning, we noticed something called striations, which are stripes or a banded appearance. And we're going to talk a little bit more why that is when we get into the microstructure. But for now, we're going to stay kind of surface. So we talked about the epimysium being the top layer of our muscle as an organ, right? Well, underneath that initial layer of connective tissue, they start to branch out into smaller portions of muscle. So under the epimysium, we have bundles of fibers, right? Another name for them is fasciculi. And there's typically about 150 fibers, depending on the muscle and the size of the muscle. You can have about 150 fibers per bundle. And there's a second layer of connective tissue that actually covers each of those bundles, called the perimysium. So we started with epimysium, then we have bundles covered in perimysium. Perimysium is, again, another connective tissue layer, just to notate that. Then you have each individual fiber, right? So if we're going inside of one of those bundles, each individual fiber is again going to be surrounded by a connective tissue layer called the endomysium. And then this is going to be connected directly to each individual cell's membrane. So imagine that each individual cell has a membrane, which we typically call the plasmalemma, but we're going to call the sarcolemma when we're talking about muscle cells. Sarco is a portion of a word that has to do with reference to muscle cells. And we see this with the full anatomy of a muscle cell structure. We also refer to it as the fluid inside as sarcoplasm instead of cytoplasm. Again, that's a prefix that's associated with muscle cells. So all of these layers collectively are going to travel the length of a muscle from tendon to tendon, and they're going to tie directly into the tendons because they are also connective tissues. And what the what the unique ability of these tissues is to take the forces that are produced within the muscle cells, the individual muscle cells, and they can transmit that force along those bands. They can take that tension and send that tension out to the tendons, and then that tension travels into the bones. And then when that tension is produced by the muscles and a muscle shortens or pulls, then those bones can then move, and then that allows the joint to go through the movement that's being produced in the body. And then we see, you know, uh, a macro movement of the body producing movements because of these tiny little muscle cells producing force. So here is a smaller scale picture, right? We looked at the whole body musculature. Now we're looking at individual muscle organ over to the far right of this picture, right? You can see the tendon, you can see the muscle belly, which is essentially our organ, the epimysium, which is that outer layer of fascia. Then you have our bundle or fasciculus, which has about 150 fibers in it. And then remember, that's covered in its own individual connective tissue as well, called the endomysium, right? And then you step down the next level and you can start to see the paramysium. Oh, I made a mistake there. So the paramysium is what covers our fasciculus. My apologies. And then the endomysium covers the individual fibers. That's a correction. And then you go down into the level of the sarcolemma, which is connected to that individual connective tissue layer, the endomysium. And then within the sarcolemma, that's our cell membrane, we have the sarcoplasm. Remember, that is the same thing as cytoplasm in a cell, but because we're talking about muscles, we have a different indicator for that. And then we have some new stuff that we haven't talked about yet, but we're going to get to in the future, the myofibril and the myofilaments, which contain the individual moving proteins in the muscle cell, the actin, which is thin, and the myosin, which is thick. So that's all we have for series 1 of our skeletal muscle system. I will see you all for the next one.